Hi there, I'm Mark Isero, and welcome to the Highlighter Article Club, where we read, annotate, and discuss one great article every month on race, education, or culture. We're in the middle of August, and this month we're focusing on Revolt of the Delivery Workers by Josh Dzieza. It's about the 65,000 workers in New York City who deliver whatever you order on DoorDash directly from whichever restaurant it comes from, all the way to your door. It's tough, demanding, competitive work performed mostly by immigrants, many of whom are undocumented, who rely on expensive electric bikes in order to eke out a measly wage. Mr. Dzieza's reporting focuses on how working conditions got worse during the pandemic, how their bikes began to get stolen at record rates, how the police didn't do very much, and about what the workers did to fight back. I hope you enjoy this interview I had with Mr. Dzieza a few weeks back, and I hope that it inspires you to read the piece. All right, let's get right to it. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for being on Article Club.
Thanks for having me.
We're super excited to ask you some questions about your piece, Revolt of the Delivery Workers, which we put in the Highlighter newsletter in September. And then since then, people have just wanted to talk about it. And so it's really great to have you on. The article is winning awards as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's been it's been really exciting to see the response. But, yeah, I got a sort of New York Press Club award recently. Some other recognitions. Exciting.
It's amazing and great. It was really pretty amazing how you reported this piece. And so, because I know that you report on a number of different things, how did you get started on this piece?
I have wanted to report on New York delivery work for a while. I've done other reporting on kind of gig platforms and sort of various ways that apps and technology are shaping labor. And, despite living in New York, the specifics of the delivery industry there were always a bit of a mystery to me. Like if you spend any time there, you'll see there's sort of a very formalized sort of outfit that delivery workers wear and use, and it's this sort of heavy duty e-bike, sort of the boxy insulated bags, various other kind of accoutrements that it seems like there's a sort of a uniform. It's very recognizable, and I was curious sort of when that started and why, and also just how they work, what the work looks like. So it kind of started as kind of a technically focused story. I wanted to find like a bike mechanic. There's some delivery workers who double as bike mechanics for other delivery workers, or someone who'd been around for a long time. And that was sort of how I started talking to workers.
And there were a number of the delivery workers that you spent a lot of time with, it seemed like, right from the beginning, Sergio and Cesar, and then Anthony. And these
Mhm.
turn out to be like fairly influential and important people in what's going on. Can you share a little bit about how you approached them and how you got to know them? And I'm assuming that you're a cyclist yourself, like even on some of the things, like how did you actually follow this story?
Yeah. So sort of when I started looking into doing a story on delivery work, there was some organizing starting to happen. It was kind of mid tail. I mean, what is the tail end of the pandemic? But it was sort of early 2021, and there had been a sort of public protest around wages and bathroom access and some other issues. And initially, I'd reached out to sort of the organizers of that and was trying to find a worker who was involved in that push who maybe I could profile. Didn't end up getting the kind of access I would need to do a feature story on them, and so I reached out to this other worker that people had talked about, Anthony, who ran just like a Facebook page. He just posted videos of himself riding around New York, giving tips on delivery work, and it had thousands, tens of thousands of followers, and it became sort of a hub to talk about bike thefts, which was sort of this issue that had been galvanizing the delivery workers to start protesting. And so I just messaged Anthony and asked him if he wanted to meet in a park at sometime when he had time and talk about his work, and he was very open about it. Sort of following him around, went to the garage where they work, where they rest, sort of between the lunch and dinner shift, and he introduced me to Caesar, who was just a guy that he met at one of these protests who started a similar Facebook page. And they were doing some organizing around sort of recovering stolen bikes and things like that. So this is sort of getting referred from one worker to another, and they're very open. I'm a cyclist, but I never really follow them around because they go too fast, and they discourage me from even trying, or like, you're just going to slow us down. We don't have time to sort of wait around for you on your non-electric bike to huff after us. But they were very open about letting me hang out with them in their in between shift times, and then also and Sergio and the others, when they started this patrol of the bridge, the Willis Bridge, where they started kind of a community watch type organization.
Yeah, they all allowed you to go to the bridge and to the garages, and it seems like you established trust fairly quickly. Given that, like in your piece, you talk about how they're stuck. It seems like they may be distrustful at the beginning, but were they open right from the beginning?
They were pretty open. They were so angry about the thefts and the lack of attention they've been getting that they were pretty open. The garage, they were not super open about initially, and I was sort of agreed to be kind of vague about the exact location of it. It's like, these garages are not really, they're not licensed or anything. They're just sort of parking garages that have attendants that start up, that maybe know somebody or start up this kind of side business. And so there were certain things that kind of I had to be a little bit vague about, but other than that, they were very open and sort of wanted publicity around the thefts, especially, and some of the things they were doing to sort of protect themselves.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like in your piece, you talk about just the entire industry and even the idea of 65,000 delivery workers. So, like, I'm in the Bay Area, most people are using their cars at this point. But the idea that, first of all, there's 65,000 and they're on their bikes, like it's just different, for somebody who's not in New York City. But it's really interesting. Like your piece at the beginning was like, okay, this is what's going on. We've got the apps, the industry's already changing. But I really felt a shift when you talked about the electric bikes and also the thefts. And it seems like they were sort of adapting. Is that right? They were sort of adapting, even though like they had to put all this money into these these bikes are thousands of dollars, and yet something started to switch them. And obviously it was that their bikes were starting to get stolen. Did you get a sense that they were like, hey, like enough is enough at this point?
Yeah, I think the bikes were definitely the galvanizing thing, because they're very expensive. They end up spending over $2,000 usually on these bikes and all the sort of other gear that goes on them, and they need them to work. And thefts did increase during the pandemic pretty sharply, but it really came on top of a lot of dissatisfaction with their treatment. Just, the pandemic saw a lot of people turning to delivery, and it wasn't reflected in higher pay really. And people started turning to delivery for very small orders, which they were doing before, but sort of the pace, the ratio of that increased. So you had situations where they're running across town. And the other thing that happened is that restaurants, now that they don't have in-person dining, they all rely on delivery, and so they expand their delivery radiuses out to ridiculous distances. And so you have these situations where the workers are going 3 miles to deliver a sandwich or like an ice cream cone or something like that, and customers who don't realize how far they've come tip them $1 or something. And you have that, you have the low pay, you have the kind of ridiculous lengths. At the same time, you have the thefts. At the same time, you have that they're getting exposed to COVID while everyone else is locked down, and people, calling them heroes and things like that. And also the fact that the restaurants, which had never been great about letting them use the restroom, were now, ostensibly for COVID reasons, not letting them in to use the restroom. Mm-hmm. So it's just sort of very demeaning, very difficult, dangerous work. And the thefts were sort of the thing that really pushed them over the edge.
Yeah, in your piece, you talk about going across town just to deliver a slice of cake. And yeah, you really get into just how the apps have shifted as well. And as a person who doesn't quite, understand how that all works, I understand, for example, that they're not well regulated, they're contractors, like that people in different industries are trying to become, actual workers. But you've been following sort of like these apps. And so how do you explain sort of just the ability for the apps just to heighten the expectation, especially on the electric bike? Like that is a huge investment that they have to buy and that they have to maintain. Is it just because there's no regulation?
It's partly the lack of regulation. It's also the way that the apps really restructured what delivery work looks like in ways that I hadn't realized or thought about before I started reporting it. I mean, there's always been delivery in New York. There's a long history of that, but it used to be workers who were, they worked for a specific restaurant. The restaurant had a delivery radius that was reasonable, 10, 20 blocks or whatever. It would, often the workers would double as like clean dishwashers or waiters or whatever. It was also a difficult, dangerous job, biking around the city delivering pizza or Chinese food or whatever, but you kind of had a home base that you could return to. You could eat there. You could use the restroom. You would be dispatched, when 5 orders were up and along a certain route that made sense. But that all changed with the apps, where you suddenly have this floating workforce that can pick up food from any restaurant, whether or not it offers delivery, and deliver it to anywhere else. And that's where you sort of get this, this sort of mid 2010s, like Uber for everything kind of dynamic, where you have a lot of advertising and encouragement from the apps to, order an ice cream cone from wherever. This place that doesn't deliver it, someone will bring it to your doorstep. It was very, kind of magical. Or they encouraged you to think of it as magical, sort of hiding the labor that happened behind the scenes. And so workers, initially kind of lured onto these apps by high pay, because the companies had sort of fantastic amounts of venture capital funding. So like for a while, people were making hundreds of dollars a day, could pay very well, moved over to these apps and kind of figured out how to make it work. And then, the pay gets ratcheted down and down and down, and they ask more and more of the workers. And then so they turned to this technology that previously had found its way into delivery work, mostly for sort of older Chinese delivery workers who needed it to just keep up, sort of to stay in the job. And it became just kind of a de facto job requirement. Like, you're not going to be able to make enough money to survive using the apps if you aren't going 30 miles an hour, 7 hours a day. And so it just became a thing that everyone needed. So it's really, it's the sort of usual pressures of, asking more of workers for less money to sort of turn a profit, though none of the apps have been consistently profitable still. But also combined with the fact that these workers aren't tethered to a restaurant anymore. They're just sort of floating around, delivering from place to place. That really changed things.
Yeah, you do note that these apps are still not making money, which just gets me to be so cynical. It gets me as a reader to think, well, they're just trying to mess things up then. Like, are they even actually trying to make money themselves? Like, they can be really oppressive, to the workers, but even after all of their funding, they're still not making money. So isn't that a problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem kind of facing the entire Uber for X cohort of companies. I think a lot of them were premised on becoming monopolies in their market, and they try to turn a profit by kind of squeezing everyone at every end. So restaurants, now that customers are accustomed to ordering off the apps, the restaurants can charge for the apps can charge restaurants for visibility, for advertising, things like that. They can pay workers a little less now that restaurants have gotten rid of their delivery workforce and they're the only job in town. And so that's how they're trying to turn a profit. But fundamentally, it's just not profitable to deliver an ice cream cone 3 miles across town. They haven't, they say that sort of, the algorithmic optimization will get there at some point, but seems unlikely. And so sort of they rely on this, very underpaid workforce that is kind of really racing around quite dangerously.
And it seems like they're relying on a very predictable workforce. And specifically, you're highlighting folks who are undocumented. I'm assuming they're almost all men. Is that true?
Yeah, almost. There are a few women, but overwhelmingly men, overwhelmingly undocumented.
Way that I thought about it, I really appreciate how you said how like there's this hope among at least some of the workers to come to the United States and make enough money and then go back to Guatemala or to Mexico. But for me, it seemed like it was very much like an indentured servitude in some ways, where they're putting in their time and they're just not making any money. And like they're trying the other app Relay, and they're trying just different things, but they're basically just scraping by. And so their frustration, is just there's just really no way to be able to save any money to send home or to save in order to go back to home. And I definitely felt like that stuckness.
Yeah, I think a lot of them do get stuck. I mean, New York is very expensive. A lot of them are living, with family members, with other delivery workers, roommates. And then you have the investment in the bike. And then if the bike gets stolen, that gets rid of, months of savings. And yeah, but most of the workers I spoke with, they wanted to come in, put in their time, work 5 years, and make enough money to return home and buy a house was sort of the general wish. But I met workers who'd been here for 10 years longer and sort of hadn't saved that money yet.
Yeah, you had one who's 19, you have them in the 30s and 40s. So you definitely were reporting a range. And then, in the middle of the piece, with the frustration, it really became clear that like they were trying to do different things. And so there's the approach of taking care of each other, because you really can't trust the bureaucracy, the police. The police doesn't even know about this whole thing. You can't actually organize. You really can't expect anything from the city. And then you have other folks, like organizers like Gustavo, who basically says, no, the way is we actually have to organize. Can you share a little bit about those different approaches, and then why, certain workers would go with either approach?
Yeah, I found this really interesting. And so you have the delivery boys, the Caesar and Sergio and the others who were really about, kind of mutual aid, community self-defense. They organized these big WhatsApp groups where workers would report their bike stolen, and then people would sort of fan out and spot the bike and then intercept the thief and recover it. And they developed these networks because the police were just completely ignoring the thefts. They would report the thefts, nothing would happen. At some point, they just stopped bothering to report them and sort of took matters into their own hands. And kind of at the same time, you have much more conventional organizing centered around the Workers' Justice Project, which is this sort of workers' center organizing group, and Gustavo and some other workers who, they hold big rallies and they have signs and lists of demands and sort of get lawmakers on their side and lobby and do things like that to sort of push regulation. And they ended up succeeding kind of incredibly quickly. In a year or so, they managed to pass just sort of first of its kind regulation of the apps, and sort of really capitalizing on kind of the rhetoric around the heroic delivery worker that you saw at that point in the pandemic. But a lot of the other workers were sort of I don't want to say mistrustful. They were sort of so cynical about the city government and the political process that they didn't really want to bother with it. They also, worried that the apps would retaliate against them, like they're undocumented. They're worried that the city cracks down on the apps will crack down on them, and they'll lose this lifeline. So there was just sort of a lot of skepticism that this was a good avenue to go down, even though they all sort of wanted the same thing. So you had sort of two branches, one sort of pushing the system for regulation, and the other that was just sort of very much about creating mutual aid structures to replace the city government.
Yeah, I can see how the mutual aid would be, those structures would be more compelling, especially if your friends are being attacked like every day or, often. And I can see how this idea of, oh, maybe we can organize for a year or two, even though it did happen quickly. It was pretty amazing, some of the progress that's been made. But I can sort of see how this idea of let's protect each other is more compelling, especially how you sort of use the end of your piece to sort of like share some really intense things that happened, like the guy with the saw, who was going around. I mean, that's really intense. And then the guy, the stakeout, the entire huge stakeout with, them like basically taking the law into their own hands and like making sure that they were able to get their bikes back. It seemed, as far as like on your reporting, you were sort of sharing that it was really important what they were doing in the moment while they were waiting for some of this organizing, to happen. Is that sort of like your view as far as like what you saw at the time that was more important to them?
Yeah, and it depends on who you talk to. So I mean, Gustavo and some of the people involved with that group were, they recognized that it was not sustainable to sort of have a second job enforcing the law and running around catching bike thieves. And so they were really sort of they were sort of tolerated that kind of behavior, but were really putting the emphasis on regulation and reform. And then the other group, it got results quickly, which is what they wanted. Like they're not planning on making this a lifelong career. They hope to sort of work it for a couple of years and go home. They just want people to stop stealing their bikes every night. And, they get results, then they post about it. And so you have these cases where they, post about recovered bikes and sort of criminals apprehended and things like that. And it sort of that gets its own kind of momentum. Like people join their groups because they see that they're the ones that are sort of very publicly getting things done in a sort of much more visible way than lobbying the political process yields.
Yeah, in your piece, you talked about Juan, who's Caesar's uncle. And it just seems like there's some folks who believe that politics is broken. There's no way that you could actually do anything about it. And it's more important to organize our people. And I guess one question that I had, because I had no idea that there's 65,000, like, do you feel like they had a sense, of just how enormous, like if they were able to sort of, organize, did you feel like they had a sense of that it's just so many people who are delivering?
It's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think that they know that there's lots and lots of delivery workers in the city. And it's interesting that something that the Deliveristas, the sort of worker justice project affiliated activist group has been trying to do is to branch out side of the Spanish speaking delivery worker networks. A lot of this stuff sort of this organizing happened along ethnic, but also just linguistic lines. It was very much among the Spanish speaking delivery workers, but it's a hugely diverse workforce. There's a lot of Chinese workers, a lot of South Asian workers, a lot of African immigrants. Like this is just sort of a small portion, and those workers are also suffering from thefts and were mad about it and would participate in some of the protests, but not to sort of the degree that the Spanish speaking workers would. I don't know that they ever sort of really the sort of more mutual aid groups, they sort of stayed in their enclave, and they were mostly sort of about defending themselves, while the activists sort of were really making an effort to translate their demands and reach out to the other communities.
Yeah. It's pretty cool that they were able to make so much progress so quickly. I know that like, you finished the story and you're on to other stories too, but do you have a sense of additional things that they might be working on now?
A lot of the problems have continued. The thefts are still a thing, but they're still posting in the groups about stolen bikes and who spotted one where. The bathroom access has gotten better. That was part of the regulation that got passed. There's sort of new controls that they have about being able to say, I won't deliver over this bridge or use this tunnel or sort of set my radius at a certain distance. I don't have a good sense of how successful that has been. I think in part because the bridge that I really focused on, they weren't working. It was sort of their commute home when they were getting attacked there. I don't know sort of how effective that has been. And in terms of what they're working on now, and so the other sort of thing that was part of that regulation is it's going to set a minimum pay and standard, and that's kind of in the works. There's a sort of a big study happening to sort of figure out what that pay level should be. I know that they're working on sort of charging stations and things like that to sort of get them out of these garages and sort of impromptu rest stops and things like that. I haven't seen how much traction that's getting with the city yet. I think there's sort of statements about broad openness to it, but it's taking a while. But yeah, that's as far as I think a lot of the problems continue. The regulation's starting to have some effects, but still a difficult job, and the thefts are still a problem.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, for all of your time on this piece. I think one big final question that I have is around consumers. And, your piece didn't really touch on consumers or people who order from these apps, but like, what's your sense? Like, what's your sense of where people are at? And what's your sense about like what we can do when choosing or not choosing to get, to make a dinner order?
Yeah, it's really tricky. And I asked a lot of the workers this, and they would all say, like, don't stop ordering delivery, because it's their livelihood. And would just sort of say, like, we'll try to be aware of the difficulty of the job and tip well, and know that you're not tipping sort of, as you would in a restaurant, like 20% or whatever of the price of the meal, but you're tipping for the labor of bringing that meal to you, which is going to be difficult, sort of no matter whether it's a ice cream or a dinner. And so that was sort of their thing. Sometimes it's better to call a restaurant, but restaurant delivery conditions vary too. And one of the big apps they work for, at least in New York, even if you call the restaurant and they have outsourced it to Relay. So it's sort of difficult to sort of be a conscientious consumer with this stuff. And ultimately it's sort of a policy question and sort of a question of how to make the working conditions better and sort of give them benefits that are more similar to being an employee in terms of health insurance and workers' comp and things like that when they get injured. But yeah, in terms of like just sort of how to be a better consumer, all the workers would just say, be more aware of the difficulty of the job. Try to know where you're ordering. For those, something else they would always say is they would deliver these tiny orders and know that the customer just had no idea where they'd ordered from. They just sort of clicked a button on the app and had no idea they crossed 2 bridges or went 5 miles or whatever. To try to be aware of that when you're tipping and ordering.
Yeah, we're gonna be able to try to figure it out. Our group, focuses on reading, and also discussing, the highest quality nonfiction. But we have started to think about, okay, what can we do? And so we'll definitely be talking about that during our conversation. But Josh, I want to thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much for being on Article Club. I just am really, really grateful.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for the thoughtful questions.
I'd like to thank Josh Dzieza yet again for generously sharing his time with us at Article Club. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I hope that you join us for our discussion of Revolt of the Delivery Workers on Sunday, August 28th at 2 p.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at highlighter.cc/discussion, or you can email me at mark@highlighter.cc if you have any questions or want to know more. All right, that's it for this week. Thank you yet again for being part of our reading community, and I hope you have a great week.